It's August 14th, 1971, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
The Stanford Prison Experiment is one of the best-known, most frequently quoted, and possibly most misunderstood psychological experiments ever mounted. And it all began today in history in 1971, when a group of volunteer college students were divided at random into guards and prisoners and placed into a mock jail and then pretty much just let loose on one another.
And those volunteers were selected after an ad was placed in the local paper seeking, quote, male college students who were needed for a psychological study of prison life, $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks, beginning August 14th. 24 men were ultimately selected. They were given criminal background checks and fairly lightweight psychological screenings. They were not chosen to be socially or ethnically diverse or representative of society at large, and some have said that the ad itself would attract a certain kind of person, but they were probably financially motivated too, because they're being paid that $15 a day, which, to be fair, is just over $100 a day and would be pretty good money for a student, but does in retrospect seem hilariously little to participate in one of the most infamous psychological experiments of all time.
Well, also, it just seems hilariously little information to be given about what they're about to endure, doesn't it? Which, to be fair, the man in charge, Philip Zimbardo of the Stanford University Psychology Department, didn't know himself. And, of course, that was the purpose of the experiment, to see how far people would go just simply by being divided. If you took people who were equally robustly psychologically equipped and divided them into prisoner or guard, how far they would go into those roles. And what was important for him is that from the very moment the experiment started, those roles were firmly entrenched. And for the 50% of the candidates who had been randomly assigned as prisoners, I didn't know this, today in history started with them being actually arrested by genuine cops who turned up in actual police cars and read out their charge sheet and their Miranda rights, just like they would for a real crime, for violating penal codes 211 and 459, armed robbery and burglary, and took them into the cars to Palo Alto police station, where they were booked and fingerprinted, moved to a holding cell and blindfolded before they were transported to the psychology department, which was pretending to be the prison, which is an amazing coup by Zimbardo to get the real police involved.
Police are like, sounds fun.
Yeah. Genuinely terrifying for the participants who didn't know it was going to happen, but also, you know, they're neighbours. It's a real street, it's a real house, they're a real family, and they're being charged with a real crime, even though they didn't do it.
Things quickly got even more intense for them because the prisoners were then stripped naked and then deloused with a spray. Each of the prisoners was then given a smock, which looked quite like a dress, actually, and then an ID number that they had to use as their name from that point on. They also wore a stocking cap and rubber sandals, and each also had a chain bolted to his ankle. It wasn't like a ball and chain. It wouldn't actually stop you getting away, but it was really to remind prisoners at all times that they were incarcerated, and basically that they were unable to escape, in inverted commas, even though there were safe words that they could use to get out of the experience. Guards, meanwhile, wore khakis, they had mirrored sunglasses and carried around a whistle and a baton, and they were really basically untrained and free to do whatever they thought at the time was necessary to maintain the idea in this mock prison of law and order. And some played perfectly nice, but others really didn't.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say, oh, it's like so shocking how quickly the guards really leaned into their role. And I'm like, I don't know, I feel like that's the most understandable part. Like, when I was a student, if I was in this, I would definitely have hammed it up in the initial exuberance. But some of the guards went further than others, you know, subjecting them to repeated roll calls, making them do push-ups. They were basically invited to incorporate their own ideas. They were sort of briefed, you know, the idea is to create psychological discomfort. So go away and do what you want. And the guards wouldn't have thought anything of this because they were not told that they were also subjects to the experiment. So they basically thought they were helping Zimbardo. They didn't think that their reactions themselves are being analysed. And several of the guards, you know, would later say they were acting. One of them explicitly referenced the movie Cool Hand Luke as his inspiration for the character of sadistic prison guard.
Which their costume was based on. performed, by the way.
Yeah, and the story goes that after 5 days, Christina Maslach, who was an assistant professor of psychology at Berkeley, came to observe the experiment, and she was so horrified about what she saw that she confronted Zimbardo, who ended it the next day. However, you might have this vague notion of Zimbardo as like this mad with power academic who had to be stopped, but actually having the experiment brought to a halt early was the most powerful support of his political statement. Zimbardo was not a neutral participant. He was a firm believer in the need for prison reform, and he'd basically already written the press release about this experiment and what it proved. In fact, he issued a press statement as early as day 2. Also, Maslach went on to marry Zimbardo, so I feel like it's fair to say that they weren't exactly at loggerheads over this.
This is 1971. And as we've talked about in many previous episodes, this is a time of hippies, the Vietnam protests. There was a groundswell of young students who sort of wanted to prove this, that anyone could be made to do something evil or illegal if they're put in a context where that is encouraged.
Yeah, and even Zimbardo himself said that he had been kind of swept along by the events that he had very much facilitated. You know, there was one moment where rumours began to spread that one of the prisoners, 6812, had been released following one of his outbursts and was arranging from the outside now a prison break to free the remaining prisoners. And when Zimbardo caught wind of the plan, he tried unsuccessfully to arrange for the prisoners to be transferred to a real prison. Guards actually blindfolded the prisoners and led them to a different floor. And Zimbardo then waited all night, but the prison break never materialized. And like his studies participants, Zimbardo later felt that he seemed to have blurred the lines between reality and make-believe by acting like a real-world prison superintendent. And I think, you know, a lot of this is kind of the story that we have received subsequently, not only from him, and the purpose of his paper, as you were saying, Rebecca, was that it needed to demonstrate X, Y, and Z, and so his own findings about his own feelings are questionable. But nevertheless, you do wonder a little bit where each of the people involved in this particular experiment did see the line between the role they were playing and what they were actually experiencing. And I think you cannot shut off the real world experience that they were having, because it's always unpleasant to be blindfolded and made to clean a toilet.
Yeah, okay, so the prisoners were having that real world experience, and that is a bit like being a prisoner. I mean, okay, hopefully if you go to prison you have actually done something illegal, whereas these guys had done nothing, so there's a slight moral difference there. But for the prison officers, which as Rebecca alluded to, this was kind of really about, that's not how being a correctional officer is it? You go through months of training.
Right.
You know, you're told what to do. There's actually a process. No one says, hey guys, do what you think's right to discipline these prisoners.
Yeah, especially because Zimbardo was literally there in the experiment. You know, no experiment would be signed off today under these conditions. And a tape recording of the orientation that he gave to guards includes him saying that they are studying, quote, the conditions which lead to mob behaviour, violence, loss of identity, feelings of anonymity. And he added, and we want to recreate in our prison that psychological environment. And then he lays out the sense of powerless, quote, that the prisoners would experience. And he said, we have total power in that situation. They have none. So from the beginning, he was telling the guards, you know, you're helping me to create a certain environment. It wasn't in any way an objective study of how ordinary people would actually respond. And a lot of the elements, you know, the horrific elements of the story, the stripping of the prisoners, the forced push-ups, but they were actually mentioned during that briefing as like examples of things a person might do.
Yeah, most psychologists now look back at this particular experiment and cut it pretty short shrift. One particular psychologist, Simone Vasari, said, we must stop celebrating this work. It's anti-scientific. Get it out of the textbooks. Anytime this experiment has been attempted to be replicated, it really hasn't had similar results. It's a shortcoming that really can't be overlooked, that even though it's very eye-catching and headline-generating, it doesn't necessarily teach us what we think it teaches us.
Yes, and does it even teach us anything about people at all, or just men? I mean, that's the other element of this, isn't it? Would women behave like this? Would they have defaulted to kind of military and homophobic tropes that these guys did in 1971? Like, possibly not. Perhaps this is about a particular kind of masculinity in a particular college campus in a particular era.
Yeah, and there's a lot of evidence that both guards and prisoners were aware that they were acting acting throughout. This is one of the things that raised questions pretty much from the off of like how authentic was the behavior and how much of it was kind of showboating and sort of pretending to be immersed in the environment. One of the guards, Guard 6, wrote in a post-experiment letter to Zimbardo, most of the time I was thinking, I got to do this thing or else the experiment won't come off right. So like everyone was colluding in creating the desired outcome because Zimbardo had made it clear what he wanted to see and they were trying to help. It totally debunks this common idea that the guards became, frighteningly attached to their new identities, that they lost their humanity. And there's evidence of the prisoners kind of blurring that line too. One of the most infamous ones we touched on earlier, prisoner 86121, Douglas Corpy, who supposedly had a mental breakdown on day 3. But in actuality, what happened is that 2 prisoners came to Zimbardo in his capacity as prison superintendent to ask to leave, and he told them that a psychological or medical episode was the only way to leave early. This was obviously untrue, and he later expressed surprise that they actually believed it. Corpy then duly goes off and has a spectacular meltdown and was released. There's still debate as to whether he was genuinely distressed, faking it, or something in between. The most likely, from what I've read anyway, his own accounts give the impression it was somewhere in between. But of the other 3 prisoners who left early, this is often said, like the prisoners were dropping like flies after just a couple of days. 2 of them did exhibit symptoms of psychological distress. The 3rd one got a rash from missing his medication.
One of the guards later told reporter Ben Blum, I took it as a kind of improv exercise. I believed that I was doing what the researchers wanted me to do. And I feel as though any single person who I went to university with would have had the amdram tendencies that would have led them into having a fit in a cell or pretending to bash up
both just admitted to, as students, being the kind of people that would have just gone along with this. I'm not.
I would have totally been into it.
Whether you've self-selected to be part of this podcast as Machiavellian narcissist.
And so another week of retrospecting ends. But next week begins a day early at Club Retrospectors. Join us now to get an exclusive episode every Sunday. Patreon.com/retrospectors.